Participation in the American Revolution and King Louis XVI's extravagant spending had nearly bankrupted France by the end of the 18th century. With so little money to go around, a plummeting mortality rate, and higher standards of living among lower classes, the growing population had become desperate to punt the status quo through several field goals. France was among the last nations in Europe to disband its feudal system, making commoners jealous of citizens elsewhere. The merchants and artisans of the bourgeoisie demanded greater political power, while landowning and educated peasants wanted opportunities to increase wealth. As the founding fathers of the United States wrote the Declaration of Independence, the initial task of French commoners was to air primarily economic grievances at the États Généraux, France's parliament at the time. These États Généraux were threefold. The first estate consisted of the clergy, the second estate consisted of the aristocracy, and the third estate represented commoners. In 1787, Charles-Alexandre de Calonne and a delegation of nobles discussed a plan to relieve the national deficit. As France's official controller of general finances, Calonne proposed that the rich should pay more taxes for the greater good. As one might imagine, this assembly refused the proposal in favor of the États Généraux, through which they could shift responsibility to the poor, since the parliament was a more complete representation of all citizens. Curiously, the États Généraux hadn't met in over 100 years, so both the rich and the poor had a unique opportunity to deal shrewdly with each other. On May 5, 1789, the Third Estate's 600 delegates, the Second Estate's 300 delegates, and the First Estate's 300 delegates began a series of meetings at Versailles. Frustratingly, the first order of business was to decide between two voting methods. A simple head count would give the Third Estate the advantage, but the estates could also submit a single vote on behalf of their delegates, thereby giving an advantage to the First and Second Estates, who were liable to vote together against the Third. Intense debate about this technicality persisted far enough into the middle of June, such that the Third Estate eventually defected to form its own National Assembly and threatened to proceed without the other two. On June 20th, royal guardsmen attempted to seize control of this situation by locking the National Assembly out of the usual meeting hall, but the delegates literally just camped out in the king's private tennis court and agreed not to leave before writing an entire constitution for a better France. King Louis knew better than to argue with the horde of homeless people shouting outside his window for several hours, though he'd begin to allocate troops toward the rogue group's dissolution on July 9th. The Third Estate's aggression resulted in the Great Fear of July 1789, during which commoners feared retaliation and aristocrats feared violence from the National Assembly that had graduated to the National Constituent Assembly. The aristocracy was right to be afraid because peasants stormed the Bastille and wrenched Paris from the king on July 14th, which has since become Bastille Day in France. In fact, peasants had been rising against their lords all over the country. Finally, the National Constituent Assembly appeased the commoners it had represented by abolishing the feudal regime as well as an oppressive tithe in August. The Assembly also outlined a Declaration of Rights for all citizens. Commoners weren't out of the woods yet, as the monarchy wasn't the only obstacle. Representatives of the clergy and nobility had been brewing an equally comprehensive counter-revolutionary effort. Many of those who escaped France due to violence sought help from neighboring countries to reobtain control. The National Constituent Assembly's proclamation that every person had a right to self-determination scared these neighbors into assisting counter-revolutionaries. There was plenty of activity along France's eastern front in the early 1790s. Armies marched in from Belgium, Germany, and Austria. In Austria herself, Marie Antoinette had actually been encouraging her brother, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, to invade, saving her and other VIPs. Determined and organized revolutionary soldiers obliterated invaders. Not only would French revolutionaries enjoy control over regions deep into the Rhineland, but they'd successfully imprisoned the royal family, finally judging Louis XVI for treason. By the time soldiers captured the king, the National Constituent Assembly had again graduated to the National Convention, which was divided further into two camps. The Girondins presented themselves as moderates. They weren't big fans of the guillotine, proposing a bourgeois-centric France to serve as a role model for the rest of Europe. Meanwhile, the Montagnards were enormous fans of the guillotine, whose primary supporters didn't wear any pants, so you know they meant business. The primary goal of the Montagnards was for lower classes to enjoy greater political and economic power. Under Maximilien Robespierre's leadership, this less compromising faction wanted to behead Louis XVI once and for all. After a series of French victories in 1792, The National Convention officially sent Louis XVI to the guillotine for betraying the French people in January 1793, and Marie Antoinette's beheading would follow a few months later. These beheadings ushered in the Reign of Terror, a difficult time during which anyone with enough money or enough of a bad reputation would have had cause to fear the guillotine. Indeed, the guillotine claimed about 17,000 suspects without trial. Between internal turmoil and Prussian reinforcements, the French would lose control of the Rhineland, but the Directory would seize control of the nation in the wake of interminable beheadings, placing France on the non-monarchical road toward political stability. Unlike England, modern-day France does not have a stupid royal family hanging over its democratic republic. Napoleon would effectively supplant the Directory by the turn of the century and embark on his famous expeditions. Though he's a 5'7" king, Napoleon is a very big can of worms that I'm not going to open because he deserves his own story. I think there's one on HBO. Anyway, let's shift gears from Europe back to European meddling overseas, as we discussed in the last video. A lackluster two-dimensional platformer, the following installment of Assassin's Creed isn't popular, even among fans, but you're likely no stranger to the quagmire that is the British colonization of India. The first British colonists had arrived in India by the middle of the 1700s. As colonies grew over the next century, they began to encroach onto the decades-old Sikh Empire in control of the Punjab, a region that was mostly in eastern Pakistan. Intuition may suggest that Sikhs adhere to Sikhism, but the religion really goes by the name of Gurmat, or Way of the Guru. With a set of unique practices, this deviation from Hinduism provided a strong sense of identity to the Punjab's people. Sikh men don't cut their hair, sporting turbans and beards that would have distinguished them from other Indians. Ranjit Singh united Sikhs under the banner of Gurmat at the beginning of the 19th century. He'd been such an effective military leader as to earn his title as the Lion of Lahore, officially becoming Maharaja of the Sikh Empire in 1801. Over nearly 40 years of rule, Ranjit Singh reformed the Sikh army, de-emphasizing cavalry in favor of well-trained infantry and artillery. The Sikh Empire also expanded into the regions of Multan, Kashmir, Ladakh, and Peshawar. By 1809, tensions between Britain and the Sikh Empire had risen enough for both parties to sign the Treaty of Amritsar, which officially entitled the two to specific regions. None of this is to mention how hotly Singh's death in 1839 would embolden the British. Singh's youngest son, Duleep, was heir to the throne. The principal problem with Duleep was that he was 5, so Mom would serve as regent until the tyke was of age. Though Jind Kaur may not have had the same military prowess as Ranjit Singh, she knew that any resistance against the British would cut down the invading army, reducing influence across the subcontinent. Potentially threatened further from above by Russia, Jind Kaur and the capable Sikh army had to fight or lose their empire. When the Sikhs and the British finally stopped beating around the bush, the Sikh army was definitely bigger. No historian has doubted Ranjit Singh's creation of a powerful fighting force with world-class equipment. This Khalsa enjoyed better pay in comparison to British soldiers, though a modest treasury would often delay payments. In total, the Sikh military boasted 6,200 horsemen, 70,000 infantrymen, 500 distinct artillery units, 1,000 religious zealots who weren't very dependable, and a healthy number of European mercenaries. Unfortunately, a decline in discipline among Sikh soldiers undermined the Khalsa's obvious advantages in numbers and equipment. Not only would lapses in pay reduce enthusiasm, but the empire also selected military leaders on account of political allegiance rather than martial prowess, leaving soldiers to do whatever they wanted. With better leaders, the outgunned and outnumbered British had no such problems. These 50,000 British soldiers had already enjoyed several victories across the subcontinent prior to the Anglo-Sikh War. From the lowliest infantryman to the most decorated commander, the British were so confident as to take multiple unnecessary risks that may have been a greater threat than actual opponents. Suffocated by Britain on all sides, Sikhs made the first move on December 11, 1845, crossing the Sutlej River into land that the Treaty of Amritsar had relinquished to the British. Bloodily brief, the First Anglo-Sikh War would last for no more than a few months, during which British forces would win all 5 major battles at Mudki, Ferozeshah, Budawal, Aliwal, and Sabrown, respectively. The primary variable over the course of the war was the degree to which Britain won each battle. The Sikhs tried to retake the Punjab with the Second Anglo-Sikh War, but the attempt was equally futile. Despite major losses, the British would endure until India gained independence in 1947. By 1849, Britain had annexed the Punjab along with the rest of India. Colonial administration had directly replaced the Lion of Lahore. So what went wrong for the Khalsa? Were poor leadership and discipline responsible? Most historians agree that treason also played a large role. Sikh commanders may not have been military men in the first place, but some didn't even stand by the cause. Tej and Lal Singh were two such commanders who took much greater interest in securing administrative positions upon Britain's seizure of the Sikh Empire, which is exactly what they did when Britain won. Turncoat generals prized defensive tactics over effective ones, costing India's final bastion against the British, on whom we'll focus momentarily. Queen Victoria lived from May 24, 1819 to January 22, 1901, officially taking control of the British Empire when she was no more than 18 years old. As industry shook the world, her reign was the first, during which the monarchy took a back seat in favor of parliamentary government. Industrialization exploded across Europe at the start of the 19th century, and England would transform from a more agricultural society to an urban powerhouse upon Victoria's rise. Sudden mass production would both increase availability and lower costs of many luxuries, from literary works and furniture to alcohol and tobacco. Many associate the Victorian era with conservatism and prudishness, particularly due to rigid gender expectations, but British citizens of the time experienced their world through a series of abrupt, permanent, and sometimes overwhelming changes. Atheism had become more common, marginalized people were fighting for voting rights, among other forms of sovereignty, and workers were banding together to guarantee safe, sanitary workplaces. Between more available products and new jobs, mass production empowered citizens who achieved agency through power. Citizens' agency would lead to the socialization of the economy, setting the stage for welfare programs, free healthcare, and low-income housing. Not only did the lowliest citizens have more stuff, but they also had more time. Indeed, a literary renaissance occurred alongside industrial advancements, resulting in a golden age of lengthy melodramas about the profound hardships of having too much money. Many of these books are popular today. I'll just throw a few names around. Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and others. But who cares about books? Admittedly, one book may have been more important than others. In 1831, a dorky grad student without a girlfriend took a boat trip to an archipelago off the Brazilian coast. As he explored this archipelago, he noticed the animals varied greatly from island to island. After years of study, the dork theorized that members of a species with the best qualities would be most likely to live long enough to produce offspring, changing that species over time. Species were capable of evolving to adapt to an environment, and the dork who posited this theory of evolution in On the Origin of Species was none other than Charles Darwin. The church wasn't happy about this discovery, but Britain's myriad God-fearers, from Hindus to Catholics, didn't persecute Darwin the way zealots had persecuted Galileo and Copernicus. You literally have to keep Templars from killing Copernicus in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Anyway, by the time Queen Victoria died, Britain was a strong contender for the most powerful nation on earth. With enough power to export and import large quantities of valuables, Britain had established control over many territories in Africa and Asia, such that imperial efforts wouldn't cease until after World War II. In fact, we end our series with a discussion of another major player in both world wars. Under Vladimir Lenin's leadership, the Bolsheviks stormed St. Petersburg's Winter Palace and took control of what would become Soviet Russia in October 1917. Historians regard this seizure as the first successful Marxist coup in history. Back in the day, dismantling a monarchy in favor of a democratic republic wasn't a big deal. Existing democratic republics like the US, France, and the United Kingdom would have been happy to assist new countries in joining the ranks of democracy. The problem, of course, was that Russia turned to communism. Above all, democratic republics feared the Iron Curtain, the notion that Russia could spread communism across the world through gradual annexation of adjacent territories. Only self-proclaimed good countries of the Americas and Western Europe could band together to contain extreme communism. Curiously, Russia may have established a democratic republic at the end of its revolution if not for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. By early 1917, revolutionaries had become fed up with the Tsar and his associates' poor handling of Russia's Western Front during World War I. After kicking Tsar Nicholas II out into glorious sub-zero temperatures, certain liberals and socialists established a provisional government to maintain order while working on a new government. But provisional government not very good. It's provisional. As temperatures skyrocketed to -2 degrees Celsius in July, dissenters rioted against the provisional government's ineptitude, resulting in several arrests, among other punitive measures. Vladimir Lenin himself went to a gulag in Finland. Writing from prison to his primary patrons, Lenin expressed urgency over the current shift of power. The only way toward a prosperous Russia for all citizens was to lean as far left as possible and stage a violent insurrection against the provisional government. A month after Lenin's statement, the Bolsheviks meticulously organized a decisive assault on St. Petersburg and won. Maybe Lenin was right. If citizens had tolerated the provisional government, perhaps Russia would have immediately become a democratic republic. Well, there you have it. We've discussed the genuine history behind the Assassin's Creed franchise's 21 games. I hope you've learned something because I certainly have. As an American, I have a much better appreciation of why my country works the way it does, why decentralized power is important, why checks and balances are important, etc. Beyond my personal experience, I think the interconnectedness of history is the main takeaway from this project. The French and Indian War invited Britain to double down on colonial profits through taxation, leading to the American Revolution. The French acquired a deficit from participating in the American Revolution, leading to the French Revolution. Thanks so much for joining me on my journey through the history of Assassin's Creed. If you actually watched this series in its entirety, I really appreciate your views. As a vicious grammarian, I've always struggled to find that sweet spot between colloquialism and formality without being awkward. I may have had my slip-ups, but every video means more practice. When I return, I'll probably share a more conventional review.